But before I head out, the storyteller had a bunch of stories to tell me if I had some books, and I've got a bunch of them.
Hello.
What is it? Death?
Hey, come on, let's get going.
Right behind you.
Now, I want you to tell me some of the stories. I have a bunch of books.
Got a story to tell?
Here, I found this book. Is it any good?
No luck, I'm afraid.
What about this one?
Let's see here. By the glow, yes! Between these damaged pages is a tale complete and intact. Yup, pre-war printing too stubborn to be dislodged by the sands of time. Thank you for this gift, friend. I'll stick by our deal and give you a tale of my own in exchange. I think I have just the story in mind. Would you like me to tell you the story now, or should we save it for another time?
Go ahead and tell me.
The future of the Mojave is yet to be decided, but back west, the future of California was decided long ago. Every tribe and settlement was brought into an alliance known as the new California Republic. However, the Republic's ascent to the preeminent power of the West was by no means guaranteed. Right from their humble origins in Vault 15, their progressive ideas and philosophies were opposed by a group that valued strength and guile above intelligence and democracy. Upon their exile from the Vault, these groups parted. One eventually became the new California Republic. The other adopted the title of a notorious warlord from before the war. Today, they are known as the Great Khans. Would you like to hear their story?
Okay, yeah, tell me.
Very well.
At night, the wasteland is dotted with towns that light up the darkness. Each one is some settler's attempt at rebuilding civilization. The wasteland holds endless wonders and mysteries. You'll never see them from within the walls of one village. Life on the road doesn't leave time for growing crops or herding Brahmin, so some people survive by taking what they need. Such predatory behavior is hardly commendable, but it does take strength to live the life of a raider, and who doesn't respect strength? Every few miles, there's some new group of raiders on the prowl, always certain that their strength gives them the right to prey on the weak. And every damned one of them has a theatrical name and flamboyant heraldry. The Fiends, the Jackals, the Yakuza. Every pack of chem addicts that stumbles across a history book just decides to play dress-up and terrorize the nearest village. Fortunately, most raider gangs don't last long. Entire groups can be exterminated in one fight gone wrong, or the whole lot can overdose on a batch of medics that's been cut too pure. But a few of the raider gangs have managed to stick around for generation after generation, and the most resilient by far is the Khans. A long time ago, many years before even the Great War, there was a place called Mongolia, home of the Khans, some of the toughest warriors the world had ever seen. They were led by a man called Genghis, and under his rule they came closer to conquering the world than anyone else. Even 1,000 years later, people still know the name. The Khans of the modern wasteland aren't actually descendants of the originals from Mongolia. They came out of Vault 15 and 2121, along with a few other raider gangs, the people who founded the village of Shady Sands. The folks that settled down in Shady Sands couldn't wait to start rebuilding civilization, but the rest, they took a liking to the wasteland just as it was. Some of those survivors from Vault 15 formed a gang called the Vipers, a band of kooks that worship snakes. They'll be remembered in the holotapes because one of them managed to kill the High Elder of the Brotherhood of Steel a century ago. But the Vipers are nothing compared to the most infamous raider gang that came from Vault 15, the Khans. The Khans value strength above all other qualities. When that vault opened, they knew that the world had become a place where the strong would thrive while the weak became prey. For years, they ranged through the remains of Arizona and California, stealing what they could carry, raising anything left behind. Under the leadership of a man called Death Hand, they thrived in an age where other bands barely managed to survive at all. In time, Death Hand grew old, his body covered in scars from a lifetime of battle. Even then, there was only one person who had the might to best him in a fair fight, his own son, Garl. The Khans would only accept leadership from the greatest warrior among them. There is no truer test of a person's strength than a fight to the death. Garl killed his own father for the right to lead the Khans, and took the title of Death Hand as his own. He led the Khans in their raids against Shady Sands and other towns in New California for years afterwards. Many settlers considered him nothing more than a bullying, low-life brute, but others suspected that Garl Death Hand was merely seeking a worthy foe. If Garl had played his cards right, he might have lived long enough to have a son of his own and one day pass on the title of Death Hand, but before he could produce an heir, he met his end. In 2162, Garl and his gang had kidnapped a girl from Shady Sands. She turned out to be the mayor's daughter, Tandy. That was a step too far for the people of Shady Sands, and it wasn't long before some do-gooder in a Vault 13 jumpsuit showed up at the primary Khan's camp demanding that Garl release her. The legend of the Vault Dweller had just begun, and the Khans couldn't have known just what they were up against. But Garl had finally found a true equal to face in combat. The Khans were hardly the greatest threat that the Vault Dweller had to deal with, and they weren't even mentioned in the Dweller's memoir. Once a damsel in distress, Tandy went on to become president of the New California Republic, where she turned the NCR into a powerhouse that Khans could never hope to match. Only one Khan managed to survive the camp massacre, a boy named Darien, who hid during the ruckus. Darien spent the rest of his life trying to atone for his act of cowardice. He created a gang called the New Khans and spent 80 years harassing Tandy and the people of her New California Republic. What Darien lacked in courage, he made up for in leadership. His New Khans were a bunch of real bruisers, maybe even tougher than the gang from the old Death Hand days. These New Khans were such terrors that they even took control of Vault 15 right under the NCR's nose. Tandy couldn't let that stand, so she sent an operative to deal with the New Khans. That operative just happened to be a direct descendant of the Vault Dweller who had slaughtered the original Khans. The old bird probably got a laugh at that. By that time, Darien was a half-crazed old man, but he went down with a hell of a good fight. The Vault 15 security system recorded his final battle, and he would have made Garl Death Hand proud. Even though Darien was dead, the Khans lived on. A handful of raiders away from Garl's camp survived and carried the legacy of the Khans with them. The largest group lived away on the fringes of the NCR under Papa Khan, called the Great Khans to honor their illustrious heritage. In 2267, Papa led them east where they discovered the ruins of Vegas. That was years before Robert House had unleashed his army of robots. The Great Khans found a home among the hardened tribals that inhabited Vegas back then. There the Khans could test their mettle against the other warriors. They wouldn't have to worry about the Vault Dweller's great-grandkids showing up to kill them all. The Great Khans had a few good years there, until Mr. House decided to send out his Securitron army and civilize the inhabitants of his town. About the same time, the NCR had begun to spread east into Nevada, too. The Great Khans know more than anyone that annihilation is an ever-present threat in the wasteland. They suddenly faced a war against two armies, so they chose to abandon Vegas rather than tempt fate. Outside of Vegas, they were of little interest to House, but they still fought NCR troops at every opportunity. The New California Republic had grown increasingly ruthless in its efforts to acquire new territory. There are those in the Mojave who saw the Great Khans as victims of NCR hegemony. The two groups had been enemies for generations, and their battles were fought with little mercy from either side. The NCR eventually won a decisive victory, though, the Battle of Bitter Springs, although most people around the Mojave call it the Bitter Springs Massacre. Bitter Springs was identified by NCR Intel as the Khans' base of operation. The NCR cornered the Great Khans and invaded the camp. That's when the Khans started evacuating the camp down a nearby canyon. First recon troops stationed there opened fire and killed most of the gang. They thought they were shooting raiders flanking their troops. They ended up killing women and children, old folks too. Almost anyone who was at Bitter Springs has a different account of what happened. It might have been a mistake, some miscommunication between the NCR commanders, or bad reconnaissance at the site, or it could have been a deliberate act of genocide. More than a few NCR troops just walked away from the army after that. Even if the massacre can be blamed on bad intel, the soldiers who pulled the trigger still had to hold themselves accountable for their own actions. Some of them have taken jobs as mercenaries protecting towns in Mojave. Get them drunk enough and they might talk about what they did at Bitter Springs. But most of them are drinking just so they can forget. The Khans, of course, can never forget Bitter Springs. The massacre left the Great Khans a broken people. The ones that survived limped away to the west, way out in Red Rock Canyon. There, the Great Khans are out of the way of the NCR and New Vegas. They lack the brute force and numbers to survive as raiders like in the old days, and now they make a living by manufacturing chems and selling them to other raider gangs. Papa Khan is aware of just how far his people have fallen, and the NCR bears the full weight of his wrath. He has even accepted envoys from Caesar in the hope that joining the Legion will allow him some final act of revenge against the NCR in the coming war. A fool's hope, but that might be all that the once great Khans have left.
Whoa.
What is it? Death claws?
You painted such a vivid picture. Thank you for the story. I was really wondering who these great Khans were. Sounds like they're pretty bad. I'm gonna have to watch out for them in the future. I think they were helping Benny try to kill me. And that thing about Bitter Springs, I mean, maybe the Khans deserved it, but women and children? The NCR isn't entirely innocent either. They both seem pretty bad. Then again, the Khans might be working with the Legion? That's not good either. I guess this is just gonna be some more dubious morality that you would expect from raiders. But wait, you mentioned something about that Robert House guy in charge of Vegas? You said he had a bunch of Securitrons. So maybe Chet was right and he did own Victor and he has a master shutoff switch and that's why he didn't participate in the fight. Victor is probably a rogue Securitron that went to live on his own, and he probably doesn't even know it. Alright, well, you got any other stories? I've got more books.
Let's see here. By the glow, yes. Between these damaged pages is a tale complete and intact. Thank you for this gift, friend. I'll stick by our deal and give you a tale of my own in exchange. I think I have just the story in mind.
Yeah, tell me.
The wasteland contains many specters that only grow more plentiful and dangerous by the day. Deathclaws, cazadors, and night stalkers. However, there is one terror of the wastes that is now, thankfully, history. A shady military group known only as the Enclave. Would you like to hear their story?
Okay.
Very well.
As far as anyone knows, this wasteland is the best damned wasteland in the world. When America and China went head-to-head 200 years ago, both sides launched everything they had, and most people assume that China was blasted back to the Stone Age. The only way to know for sure is to jump in a boat and paddle across the ocean, so folks just assume that China, Europe, Canada, and the rest of the world got hit at least as bad as America did. People look out at this land, and some of them just know in their hearts that it's the garden spot of the whole world. Maybe that's why we can't go more than a few decades without someone trying to take over the place. When humanity was just beginning the struggle to rebuild after the war, there was no sign of the government helping out. People formed tribes led by the strongest warriors and the smartest scavengers. The chain of command and the line of succession meant nothing to people who needed things done fast. The closest thing to a government that emerged was tribal elders, or the mayors of small villages. Eventually, in 2189, some of the larger towns in California banded together and formed the new California Republic, but they never claimed to be the government. With no communications from the pre-war government for over a century, the memory of it faded as new generations replaced the old, convinced the old president and his kind were long dead, but the wasteland ain't so lucky. 200 years ago, the last days before the Great War, a secret coterie of America's top-ranking political and corporate leaders decided to duck and cover, big time. They scurried right off the continent and hid inside a secret offshore base, then cowered there while the rest of the country suffered a nuclear holocaust the government had caused. There they stayed, safe and hidden for decades. The group we know today as the Enclave is the result of 10 generations of breeding between politicians, military brass, and corporate executives. The direct descendants of the people who caused the apocalypse? Not many people would make up a story like that, so it's probably safe to take them at their word about their ancestors. Regardless of who their great-grandparents were, the Enclave certainly has access to an abundance of pre-war tech and weapons. They hoarded it on a man-made island. a metal city that grew out of the ocean floor. It was once used to refine oil, back when people could pull oil right out of the bottom of the sea. The Poseidon oil rig was inaccessible to people on the mainland, so no one knew they were out there until they began their plan to rid the wasteland of everyone who didn't fit their definition of a real American. The Enclave had spent decades learning to improve upon pre-war weaponry. They weren't just collecting artifacts of the old world like the Brotherhood. They were looking toward the future. They had devices more advanced than anything seen in the wasteland, including the Brotherhood. It wasn't just better guns or the ginchiest armor. The Enclave had a fleet of flying vehicles they called vertibirds. Most folk had never even seen a car move unless it was hitched to a team of ramen, so these vertibirds gave the Enclave an edge over every other human group in the wasteland. They could send in drop teams to kidnap whole villages at a time to use as test subjects. They could suddenly appear at remote locations, then just as quickly disappear. Most importantly, they could travel to and from their offshore base secure in the knowledge that no one could follow. Well, almost no one. There was a person back then who seemed to have a knack for getting vehicles up and running again. People who lived in the den swear up and down that somewhere around 2242, they saw a person in a vault jumpsuit driving around in an old Christless Highwayman, the big green mutant taking up the entire back seat, and a cyborg dog poking his nose out the window. That's a sort of tall tale that would be easy to dismiss, but it happened in the same year someone managed to get a ship seaworthy again. They sailed that tanker right out into the ocean to the Enclave's base and took them down. Stories like that, they fill a body with hope. Maybe with enough work we could all be driving around in pre-war cars, living the good life. In a way, that sort of hope for the future was what the Enclave wanted, and they got it at the cost of their own lives. Their ambition was their downfall. They weren't content to live out their lives in prosperity. They had to take back their country from the people they viewed as subhuman. To do so, the Enclave engaged in the sort of daredevil science that brought about the end, the Great War. They engineered a virus tailored for genocide, performed inhuman experiments, and even took to playing God by creating a species of intelligent deathclaws. Just like their ordinary brethren, they were giant beasts that could rip a man in half, but smart enough to think like you and me and even mimic human speech. But even deathclaws were nothing when compared to the Enclave's deadliest creation, a man named Frank. It's hard to say just what Frank Horrigan was. People who saw him in person tended to die quickly and gruesomely. At some point he must have been a man, a brutal killer, but still human. When the Enclave discovered the old Mariposa military base and the forced evolutionary virus bats within, Horrigan was exposed by accident. He was among the first of a new generation of super mutants created years after the Master's downfall. The arrogance of the Enclave's leaders led them to believe that they could improve upon the virus. The FEV and Horrigan were used for horrid experiments that would make the Master cringe. When they could learn no more from his suffering, the Enclave turned Frank into their most devastating soldier, a mutated cybernetic terror encased in their finest power armor. It's hard to imagine how anyone managed to defeat arguably the most dangerous being to ever walk the wasteland and bring down his Enclave masters. But somehow, the chosen one of an obscure northern tribe destroyed the Enclave oil rig, forcing the Enclave to flee New California. Leaderless and directionless, they soon rallied behind Autumn, a senior scientist who was contacted by a new Enclave president. It didn't take long for the remnants to reach the East Coast with their vertibirds. They had no fancy oil rig this time. They soon nestled into Raven Rock and Adams Air Force Base, pre-war bases that were nearly as impregnable. They changed their routine in Washington, D.C., promising that they could guide America back to the golden age of malt shops and drive-in movies. On the West Coast, they had a man who claimed to be the rightfully elected President of the United States. But by the time they reached the capital wasteland, things had changed a little. Now their president remained unseen and only addressed the public through a swarm of floating propaganda robots that spewed stars and stripes forever, along with political rhetoric so hollow that it sounded like it was written by a random word generator. The war for control of the capital wasteland was a trial for the Enclave. Bereft of their island fortress, without the unstoppable brutality of Frank Horrigan, they had to fight a hard war to gain territory. The Brotherhood of Steel had a strong presence in Washington, D.C., and super mutants roamed the streets looking for humans to abduct. The Enclave still had their technological superiority and their vertibirds. They even took control of pre-war satellites, and could fire missiles that had been waiting in the sky for hundreds of years. But their greatest weapons were deceit and manipulation. The Brotherhood relied on a local wanderer for help in combating the Enclave. It is possible that the Enclave managed to convince this individual to implement a more subtle plan that could accomplish their goals even after their repeated defeats at the hands of the Brotherhood. Yet, it did not save them. In 2277, following their disastrous defeat by Liberty Prime at the Purifier, the Enclave was shattered again. With its leaders dead or missing, its major strongholds were soon annihilated by Brotherhood strikes. The few surviving members probably wished that they had stayed hidden on their private island out in the Pacific. Now the once mighty remnants of America's elite have been reduced to a handful of wistful old men hiding out in the wastelands. Most gave up on the Enclave's vision of the world and settled down to live quiet lives, getting as much peace as a person can in the wasteland. Travelers who visit a certain old motel in Novak can speak with a former Enclave pilot who isn't as bad as the legends make the Enclave sound. She's a tough old broad, but she's no Frank Horrigan. Out east, the Enclave continues to operate in small bands that harass the Brotherhood and anyone else who strays too closely to their remaining outposts. But they are devoid of leadership or any long-term plans. In the west, sharp-eyed travelers can sometimes spot the rusted hulks of crashed vertebrates. There's little else remaining of the Enclave, or at least that the Enclave wishes to reveal. Could an organization with such resources be entirely stamped out? Much like radroaches, the Enclave has shown remarkable resilience. The people of the wasteland should be prepared to deal with another hidden nest of these relics of the old days. For now, the Enclave has joined the ranks of those who fancied themselves the rightful rulers of the wasteland. Their glory has faded along with that of others like the Master. But it seems like some lessons are never learned. There's always someone new looking to claim our wasteland as their own.
Wow. Ugh.
Got a story to tell?
What an apt comparison to rad roaches. Gotta stamp those fuckers out. You're completely right that they're not gone. I mean, have you heard that radio signal? There's definitely still some here in the Mojave. I knew a lot of that already, but you definitely gave me some details that were really interesting. So they did create the intelligent death claws. Good to know. And you don't ever have to worry about if the Lone Wanderer helped President Eden. I can assure you she did not. I got another book. Is it good?
Let's see here. No luck, I'm afraid. The words of the pages have long since faded away to be anywhere near legible. If there were any stories in here, they're now long gone. Poor little guy. You probably had a great story to tell once. Now, you will act as your own pyre, not to mention give me a chance to test Edna's laser optic and targeting systems.
Oh, is that a robot? Well, here's another book.
Let's see here. No luck, I'm afraid. The pages have been damaged and charred, likely by exposure to a nuclear detonation. Another unnamed victim of the nuclear holocaust. Like America, you're only the remains of your former self. I think I might cry. That said, I have a creaky table with one leg significantly shorter than the other. This charred tome might still find a purpose.
I'm sorry. Yeah, losing knowledge like that is pretty sad. It's kinda cute how sad you get about it, though. Here's another book.
No luck, I'm afraid.
Damn. What about this one?
Let's see here. By the glow, yes!
All right!
Between these damaged pages is a tale complete and intact. Thank you for this gift, friend. I'll stick by our deal and give you a tale of my own in exchange. I think I have just the story in mind.
Yeah, tell me a story.
This story is about the ghouls. Would you like to hear it?
Okay.
Very well.
The radiant heat of an atomic bomb can turn a human body to ash in an instant. The shockwave can crush bones and burst organs for miles in every direction. And those unfortunate enough to survive will soon succumb to the unseen threat of radioactive fallout. Most bodies will lay down and die once they've absorbed enough radiation. A horrible death that takes days, but may be better than the alternative that some people face. ghoulification. Plenty of people in the wasteland will shoot ghouls on sight. They look like zombies or mummies, monsters right out of old horror vids. The tragedy is that most ghouls are just as intelligent now as they were back when they were human. They're perfectly aware of what's happened to them. There's still plenty of them that have gone feral, though. Spend enough time in a rotting body, and they degenerate into little more than animals that attack any human they see. Most folk think it's better to just shoot first and worry about being called a bigot later. We're not sure why some people turn into ghouls, while others just keel over after being exposed to radiation. The history tapes don't mention ghouls existing before the Great War, so something must have changed back around the end of the 21st century. Well, a lot of things changed, but even the best minds of the wasteland can't figure out which factor causes ghoulification. The planet was covered with unprecedented levels of radiation. Some of the sites holding stockpiles of forced evolutionary virus were hit in the war, and trace amounts of the virus were released into the atmosphere. Humanity's gene pool had also been reduced from billions of people down to a smattering of survivors, many of which had been selected by Vault-Tec for dubious purposes. Ghoulification might happen when folks get just the right dose of radiation. Could even be a hereditary trait that was always present in humanity, but only activated by high levels of radiation exposure. Walk the wasteland long enough, and you'll find evidence for all these theories and more. When the Great War happened, thousands of people made it to Vault-Tec facilities in time to survive the nuclear bombardment. Most of them were kept safe from the ensuing fallout. There is one vault, number 12, where the doors didn't close all the way. They shielded most of the radioactivity, but just enough got through to turn Vault 12's population into ghouls. Every one of them was chosen by Vault-Tec. They have a history of rigging their vaults to experience theatrical malfunctions, so it can't be a coincidence that the doors failed to seal up. This supports the notion that ghouls have a pre-existing dormant trait, but it could also mean that the scamps at Vault-Tec knew the exact amount of radiation to let in. Either way, the ghouls who lived in Vault 12 used their pre-war technology to create a prosperous, if unsightly, town. Humans stayed away from the place, though naming the town Necropolis probably didn't help with tourism. The ghouls got along pretty well by themselves for close to a century. One of the few good parts about a ghoul is they don't age like humans do. Some of the pre-war ghouls are still kicking today. Unfortunately, most of them were killed a while back, because Necropolis was one of the first places to be overrun when the Master unleashed his mutant army. The mutants stormed in, hoping to find a vault full of pure strain humans with no trace of mutation. They must have been hopping mad to learn that all that was left of Vault 12's gene pool was a bunch of radioactive zombies. The ghouls managed to keep an uneasy truce with the super mutants for a couple of years, but eventually the mutants turned on them and slaughtered most of the town. It was nearly 100 years after the Great War, but the folks from Vault 12 finally made it into their graves. Some of the surviving ghouls made it to the few settlements that would tolerate their kind, like Broken Hills, where they lived with humans and mutants alike. Others just set up shop in places too heavily irradiated for anyone to bother them. Another perk of being a ghoul is that they don't get sick from radiation exposure. Hell, some of them even feed off the stuff and get a robust, healthy glow when they're around it. A few of them settled in a town around near a broke-down nuclear reactor in California. They got it running again, even though it probably wasn't up to its pre-war safety standards. They were smart enough to trade their electricity with the surrounding cities, too. They had the idea that if they could provide enough power to their neighbors in Vault City, then they might be able to use some of that Vault-Tec medical equipment to find a cure for being a ghoul. Nothing ever came of that idea, though. Vault City wasn't known for helping out their neighbors back in those days. A few scientists are still looking for a cure, including a ghoul doctor in Washington, D.C., but there aren't any tales of ghouls being miraculously renewed. Plenty of hucksters are looking to trick them into thinking there's a cure, or a better world waiting for them in the sky. Not far from the Colorado River is a glowing preacher who claims he's going to take his flock of faithful ghouls to some sort of utopian space paradise. That is, they can get their spaceship repaired. Back in the town of Gecko, they had some mysterious genius hidden away beneath the town with a plan to renew their humanity somehow. They should have been a little suspicious, since the cunning plan involved gathering large amounts of cheese-flavored snacks. Large ghoul settlements are rare these days because many factions within the wasteland have tried to annihilate them entirely. The Enclave has attempted genocide twice in the last 40 years, and the Brotherhood of Steel isn't exactly sympathetic to their plight either. There's a secret ghoul city built into an old museum out in Washington, D.C. They have a lady who remembers the days before the bombs fell. She tries to help out the unfortunate people who have recently transformed. Yeah, people are still turning into ghouls. Doesn't happen often, but every now and then some lucky bastard will spend too much time near a hotspot, find themselves slowly turning into a walking hunk of beef jerky. A person can never tell if they'll ghoulify. Even if they stay away from radiation, they can still end up looking a ghoul if they get exposed to the forced evolutionary virus, the stuff that created the super mutants. Normally, when someone is dipped in a vat of FEV, they come out looking Boris Karloff with a touch of seasickness. There's a few mutants who developed other forms of genetic aberration. Holotapes recovered from the Master's old base in Mariposa speak of people who gained psychic powers and other unique alterations. A couple of these failed attempts at perfecting the super mutants ended up looking just like ghouls. One of them used to live out in the boneyard to the west, joined up with the followers of the Apocalypse over a century ago. Their records say he was an ordinary human before he was dipped in the FEV vats. He was pure strain human too, fresh out of one of the vaults, and he still came out of the vats looking like a brain eater. He might still be alive out there too, if his mutation gave him the same long lifespan of the other mutants. There's another old mutant who emerged from the vats looking just like a ghoul. He was a survivor of the Great War and was the first mutant to walk the wasteland, or at least that's how he tells the story. He calls himself Harold, and he claims that he had a hand in just about everything that happened over the last 200 years. He survived the Great War inside one of the nicer vaults, and used to know the super mutant master back when the master was just an ordinary human. Also claims he was good friends with the Vault Dweller who defeated the super mutant army a century ago. Funny that Harold isn't mentioned in the Vault Dweller's own memoir. Harold even said that he helped the Chosen One bring down the Enclave when they tried to take over California. That might have happened. Plenty of people remember both of them being in the town of Gecko at the time. But Harold's got a fuzzy memory, so take his stories with a grain of salt. Being over 200 years old will make a body go a little senile, and Harold's got some unusual problems with his brain on top of old age. It started out as a little twig growing out of his head 100 years ago, some side effect of his mutation. Over the decades, that little branch just kept growing and growing until Harold ended up more tree than man. He wandered the country for years at his own deliberate pace. Then he took root out east in a desolated spot. By that time, he looked more like a face growing out of a tree than of a tree growing out of a zombie. He even gave off seeds that took root in the surrounding soil, so he ended up attracting a cult of tree worshippers who thought he was some kind of forest god restoring the earth. They pester him all day long, seeking his divine wisdom, and poor old Harold just can't find any peace. They're mostly harmless, and they'll even let travelers in to see Harold if you agree to drink their psychedelic tree sap. Harold enjoys the company, likes having someone around to hear his bad jokes. Not much coherent news comes out of Oasis these days, but travelers from the capital wasteland say that the trees north of Washington, D.C. have been looking a mite greener the last few years. That could be due to the Brotherhood of Steel purifying the water in the D.C. basin, but it would be nice to think that old Harold was still out there, making the world a more colorful place.
Oh my god, I have so much to say.
What is it? Death claws?
Okay, first of all, Harold was great. He's an amazing guy. Unfortunately, he passed away a while back, but he was a good person, and kind of miss him.
I was exploring some sort of a military base with some other people. I think it was called Mariposa.
The stuff about ghouls was really interesting too. People really overestimate how many were pre-war. A lot of them are post-war. Yeah, you mentioned the genocides, and They are a minority group. Both the Enclave and Brotherhood have been pretty cruel to ghouls. Well, I've got more books. Here, is this one any good?
Let's see here. By the glow, yes! Between these damaged pages is a tale complete and intact. Thank you for this gift, friend. I think I have just the story in mind.
All right, tell me.
This story is about the super mutants. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah, go ahead. That's a fitting follow-up.
Very well.
When the Great War annihilated civilization, the survivors lost their loved ones, their homes, and their worldly goods. They endured a daily search for food, water, and medicine. They also had to seek out their lost identities. People have always defined themselves by the work they do, the place they live, the things they own. In the Great War, it wasn't just buildings that were destroyed. Entire cultures were erased from history. In the brutal years that followed, the survivors had to define themselves again, find meaning in their existence, or face a metaphorical loss of their humanity. But a much more literal threat to their humanity was already in place, waiting quietly beneath the desert for someone to stumble across it. Someone did, nearly a century after the war, and that threat came closer to extinguishing humanity than all the bombs and guns of the old wars. A single neutron passing through a strand of DNA can cause a cancerous tumor, but a lifetime of exposure to unprecedented amounts of atomic fallout will have wildly unpredictable results. After a few generations of passing on this defective DNA, a species will begin to mutate. That explains many of the strange beasts running around the wasteland, but not all of them. There's a different strain of mutant out there. They're shaped like men, but bigger. Some of them are more dangerous than Deathclaws, stronger than a man in power armor. They call themselves super mutants, and they're not the result of random contact with radiation, but rather a deliberate act of genetic tampering. Holotapes unearthed in pre-war military installations show that the United States government started out with good intentions. Rival nations had attacked America with biological weapons, resulting in a new plague, so America's leaders created their own defensive virus. The plan, originally, was to make a germ that would mutate America's population just enough that they would become immune to the viruses that the enemy might use. In a sense, this forced evolutionary virus worked, but the effects were much more drastic than anticipated. The animal test subjects mutated by it were not only resistant to common biological weapons, they also grew stronger and more intelligent, but monstrously deformed. In Maryland, the virus was placed in a Vault-Tec vault and used as part of their cruel experiments. According to files recovered from a Vault-Tec mainframe, the people who took shelter in that vault were exposed to the virus by their own overseer, the very man assigned to protect them after the bombs fell. After escaping the war, these people suffered even worse than those trapped on the surface. The mutation process is painful, and most people exposed to the virus die a horrible death in a body they don't even recognize as their own. Those who do survive often wish they hadn't, because their very humanity is taken from them. Whatever they look like before mutating, they transform into an enormous, bald, green brute. That sudden loss of identity would enrage almost anyone. Maybe with enough therapy a person could come to terms with their new body. But most of the poor creatures suffered from another side effect: reduced cognitive capability. Despite the virus's potential to increase intelligence in some people, most of the super mutants on the East Coast were just plain stupid. In fact, many of their brains were too small to perform even basic autonomic functions like breathing. For those that survived, there were some positive trade-offs. Their strength increased tremendously, as did their size. Even the small ones are nearly 10 feet tall. In the capital wasteland, these beasts continue growing throughout their existence. Wanderers have reported fighting super mutants that are 15 feet tall, and foolhardy adventurers have pumped hundreds of bullets from assault rifles into mutant overlords without bringing them down. Scouts from the Brotherhood of Steel even claim to have fought super mutants that are 20 feet tall and can survive a direct hit from a mini-nuke. The only factor that keeps them in check is that they are infertile and cannot reproduce, at least not the way that they did when they were still human. The first mutants created in that horrid vault might not have been as intelligent as the humans who created them, but they had strength and righteous fury on their side. The mutants turned on their creators and transformed them into the next generation of super mutants. And in time, the Vault was nothing but mutants, alone, undying, and just intelligent enough to know that they had been betrayed by humanity. Forcibly stripped of their humanity, robbed of their ability to reason, and transformed into massive brutes, they were an angry horde trapped inside a vault. Rage and boredom are an unstable mixture, and eventually that vault burst. Hundreds of super mutants emerged into a wasteland where their enhanced physical abilities made them better suited to survive than the humans around them. The disorganized humans had only one advantage, and that was their numerical superiority. Outnumbered and unable to breed, the mutants were still cunning enough to understand that they had to boost their ranks by kidnapping humans and exposing them to the virus. Further west, things were more complicated. California and the West Coast had their share of trouble with super mutants, but those mutants, they didn't just suddenly pop out of a vault and rampage like mindless savages. The mutants of the Wasteland's core region were the result of a misguided plan to set the world right. The mutant army was smart enough to scour the lands for new humans to mutate, and to select people with little exposure to radiation. Using humans with DNA undamaged by radioactivity meant they were more likely to keep their intelligence after mutating. The size and capability of this inhuman swarm grew, always hungering for the purest human DNA to serve as the building blocks of a master race. This was before the new California Republic had solidified, before the Enclave chose to reveal itself, back when the Brotherhood of Steel kept their technology closely guarded. There was nothing to stand against an army with such organization, such single-mindedness, such unity. Who they had been before no longer mattered. The super mutants weren't divided by old-world notions of race, and they did not bicker over religious beliefs, for they all worshipped the same dark god and claimed that they could hear his voice in their heads. Did this dark god exist? Were the mutants led by some cunning mutant general? Could the master race have a master of its own? Someone or something was certainly behind this new unity movement. No doubt, through much trial and error, this dark god created generations of flawed beasts before finally discovering that the FEV works most effectively on people who have low levels of radiation exposure. Access to pre-war computers revealed that the Wasteland held secret communities of uncontaminated vault dwellers whose gene pools had been protected for generations deep beneath the earth where the radioactive fallout couldn't reach them. It's ironic that the super mutant master was done in by the actions of one of these vault dwellers. Regardless of how it happened, with their master gone, the mutant army scattered. The former elite guard of the mutant army have taken the fall of their master the hardest and have become an unpredictable menace. These Nightkin, as they call themselves, were once the best of their species, augmenting their strength and cunning with pre-war stealth technology. They are usually still in possession of the rare Stealth Boy devices and use them without concern for the harmful effects of prolonged exposure. After decades of constant use, their minds have degenerated and their skin is darkened to a distinctive gray. They're plagued by hallucinations and imaginary friends. Often their jabbering is the only sign that one is nearby. Due to their tendency to appear in unexpected places and engage in bizarre behavior, a single Nightkin can be more dangerous than a group of their green-skinned brethren. Some super mutants have formed their own communities, following charismatic leaders across the wasteland. Turn a radio to the right frequency in the right parts of Nevada, and there is a broadcast coming from a mutant girl who thinks she can take the Master's place and guide the mutants to a new utopia. Although she has gathered many followers, her mental instability ensures that this is unlikely. Some wanderers even speak of outright friendly super mutant companions who accompany them as friends and equals. Given their resilience and long lives, these benevolent creatures could still be out there looking for new adventures and traveling companions. A few diverse communities consisting of humans, ghouls, and mutants alike have popped up, at least for a time. Despite the best efforts to get along, it seems that differences will always reduce people to fighting among themselves. Perhaps that dark god was right, and what the Wasteland really needs is more unity.
Oh, okay, yeah, the super mutants are complicated.
What is it? Death claws?
I definitely don't think they were right, though. Unity isn't the answer. Diversity is our strength. Being able to work together despite the differences, is what makes us strong. Gathering from what you said, there were several different groups of super mutants. So there was the Mariposa strain, and then there was the first generation and the second generation. First being the Master, second being Enclave. And then there was that Fort Dagger Point strain that I saw. And then there's also that Vault 87 strain you were talking about. They all have their differences. Honestly, there's probably more strains out there that we don't even know about. I didn't know that about the Nightkin, though. Thank you. I'll try to look out for them. Maybe they just need some help. The super mutants aren't evil. They didn't ask to be made that way, but it's hard to be nonviolent with them. It's worth trying, though. That was my last book, but I think Delilah has more at her place. Follow me.
Bye-bye now.
Who's that? Hello?
I'm sorry, but I am not at liberty to chat right now.
Oh, okay. Hello?
Hey there, need anything?
Is that robot yours?
Sure, here's what I've got.
Alright. Guess you're just a merchant. Well, carry on. I don't think that Delilah will mind if I take some of these.
Got a story to tell?
Here's some books. Oh, wait, you don't have any more stories to tell. Or maybe you're just tired. I guess that would make sense. I'll go drop you off back at home then.
Bye-bye now. I'm sworn to carry your burdens.